In the 1870s and 80s, with the rise of the progressive movement and the social gospel, especially after about 1885, we began to see the transformation of what I would call the whole American political tradition. It moves away from the traditional language of individual rights, moves away from the whole concept of localism, decentralization, individual autonomy from the government. And it moves to something very different, which is the idea of central planning, the idea that an intellectual elite that has been trained in the best institutions, passed certain kinds of examinations, that this elite is the source of wisdom in a society, and that this elite can begin to direct the overall society, and especially the economy, by means of legislation. This has no prior development that I'm aware of in American political life. There is a centralizing tendency with the Hamiltonians. They want to do certain kinds of productive works, they would say, like building bridges or setting up some sort of an American highway into the West. But this is not the idea that you plan the economy. This is simply the idea that you use tax money to develop certain projects that you think will be really positive. This is not telling you, no, you've got to make this, no, you've got to have these kinds of safety devices, no, you can't do that because this violates pages and pages of regulations in the Federal Register. The Hamiltonians, who become the Republicans, are basically in it for, let's make government bigger so that we can get richer, so that we can invest in these companies, we can invest in various outfits that are going to make us rich because we're productive. So we build a canal, we build a railroad line, we do it in part with federal money or federal grants of one kind or other, and we participate in the benefits. But of course everybody gets to participate, but obviously if you get in there first and you're a shareholder, you really get to participate. This becomes the Whig tradition in the 1840s, and it becomes the Republican Party's position in Lincoln and beyond. That you want to have a strong central government. The government is to do good things for the people, but the government's really not supposed to tell people how to live. The government is not supposed to direct the social order. The government is supposed to intervene and promote certain kinds of projects that will help the whole community, and especially the shareholders who got in early. You might call that spoils. You might call it boodle. And it is spoils, and it is boodle. It is loot. But it's good old-fashioned American loot. It's the loot of building up something that generally serves the population, and then you participate because you got in early and you got some kind of a federal grant to do it. That's the good old-fashioned American tradition. This is not what we're talking about with the rise of left-wing social Darwinism, the progressives, the social gospel people. They're not talking about loot, at least not officially. And they're not talking about getting in certain kinds of deals so you make a bundle because you bought the stock early. They're talking about redirecting the American economy away from the free market system and in the direction of central planning. This has nothing to do with anything American prior to about 1880. That's a new tradition. It's a Darwinian tradition. In the 1880s and the early 90s, the Democratic Party is powerful in the South because it was opposed to Lincoln and it was opposed to Reconstruction. It was opposed to the Republican Party. So the Democrats have almost a free rein in the South. They do have constituents north of the Mason-Dixon line and in the West. And one man takes that to the presidency twice. and that's Grover Cleveland. Cleveland is a Presbyterian, at least in terms of where he attends church. He is a limited government man. He is a gold standard man. He doesn't like taxes. He doesn't like a big government surplus. He actually signs a bill in which they return the surplus of the federal government and lower taxes back to the people. When was the last time that happened? He's elected in the late 1880s. Then he's defeated briefly by another Presbyterian, Benjamin Harrison. And Harrison loses to Cleveland again in the mid-1890s. And Cleveland is sort of the representative of the old Democratic Party. It is Jeffersonian. It is Jacksonian. It is in favor of limited government. It is in favor of the gold standard. It is in favor of low taxes. It is in favor of low tariffs. It wants government hamstrung. That's the Cleveland wing of the party. And it is the dominant force of the Democratic Party until one fateful day. And we can date that day of the change. And it was the day that a congressman out of Nebraska gave the final speech at the National Democratic Convention. His name was William Jennings Bryan, and the speech has come down through history known as the Cross of Gold speech. He was an inflationist. He was pro-silver because it was inflationary, he thought. He was an interventionist. He was also a Presbyterian. He believed in centralized government locally. He wanted municipal governments to have more power. He wanted state governments to increase their regulatory abilities. He was in favor of government regulation at the national level. He was a radical. And in fact, he was the most radical man ever to run for president up to that time. And in terms of what the candidates actually said, he was the most radical president ever to run, or at least nominee, hoped for nominee, trying to become president. In terms of his rhetoric, in terms of what he openly campaigned for, this was the most radical man in American political history. Completely dissociated with whatever you would have thought has been the American political tradition. Bryan broke with it, and he was nominated 3 times by the Democrats. And by the last time, 1808, he made this statement. He lost, but it was clear that the Democratic Party had fundamentally changed. And in fact, in 1904, when the last of the gold standard Democrats ran, a man that you've never heard of called Alton B. Parker. Parker lost to Teddy Roosevelt, and Bryan said, this is the last of the Cleveland Democrats. This is the end of them. And it was. And in 1912, there are 3 candidates for president, and they're all progressives. There is Teddy Roosevelt, there is the president, William Howard Taft, and there is the governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. And all 3 of them, as you can probably figure out from my perspective, all 3 of them were on the wrong side of the issues. All 3 were progressives. All 3 believed that the federal government should be an agent of social change. And in that same period, you have the direct election of senators. You have at least the announcement of the passage of the income tax amendment. And in the final days of 1913, that first year of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, you have signed into law the Federal Reserve Act. These are trust busters. These are centralizers. These are people committed to the idea that the government should be an active policymaker in the lives of Americans. Of course, not to the stage we accept today, but certainly much more than anyone would have officially accepted in 1890, except perhaps a local progressive or a social gospel guy in the pulpit. This was the new America. And any break from this America, any attempt to overthrow that unified policy was going to be perceived as reactionary. Reactionary. to oppose the expansion of government, to oppose the expansion of regulatory power by government agencies, to oppose the income tax, was considered to be simply, wasn't called right-wing, it was reactionary politics, 19th century politics, which of course it was. That's exactly what it was. It was the Democratic Party in 1895. But it was not the Democratic Party in 1915. And so the transformation took place, and it was the power of Darwinism and the power of the social gospel among the intellectuals that justified this transformation of American political life. And from that point on, then the conservative versus liberal issue was progressivism versus anti-progressivism. And the anti-progressive could be a Republican who thought there was too much interference by the government in his pet project where he had his money invested. So that, in other words, it was a Republican opposition to too much taxation. And it was the old Jeffersonian, old Jacksonian, and above all, old Cleveland position of shrink the government, hold to a gold standard, don't have a central bank, don't have regulatory agencies, shrink the federal government down, states' rights, let's roll back the modern state. That becomes the position of what is known as the reactionaries. And there weren't all that many reactionaries. You have some slowing down of the process in the 1920s, primarily because of the personal characteristics of Calvin Coolidge, much ridiculed president, but a good president. Oversaw considerable prosperity, didn't believe the federal government should meddle in the affairs of business, made the famous statement that the business of America is business, did not approve of what he called the social planners, and by the way, who was a real opponent of Herbert Hoover. He referred to Hoover as the Wonder Boy. He didn't have much use for Hoover at all. Thought Hoover was too much of a tinkerer, a planner, and Hoover was. So you have this one brief period from the 1913 election. You have a brief time, which really doesn't count with Harding because he was president for such a short period. And you have the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, who in a sense kind of slows down the expansion. Hoover gets caught by the Depression and expands government rapidly, wants more government intervention, wants to help business to keep business from cutting prices, approves of and signs into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raises taxes, import taxes. They're sales taxes on imported goods, which pushes the country deeper into recession. Hoover is a tinkerer. Hoover is a classic example of a man that you could legitimately call a progressive and would not have opposed that title. He was a central planner in a Republican form. And Roosevelt, in 1932, campaigned against him as a man who had expanded the debt, had expanded federal spending, who had to be stopped to balance the budget and get the economy rolling again. That was the campaign position of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. Now, of course, the two of them had worked at least together on some issues. Roosevelt had been a bond salesman before he became governor of New York. He was part of the establishment, as was Hoover. But when it came time to run for office, Franklin Roosevelt was there defending the old language of the old democracy, of the old Cleveland style of politics. Stop that expansion of federal power. Stop that wild man Hoover who's going to spend us into oblivion. Now, of course, as soon as he's elected, he amplifies everything Hoover had done, takes suggestions that Hoover had, including the bank holiday, shuts down the banks, radically centralizes power, as never had been done in peacetime in American history, overthrows his campaign promises of the 1932 campaign, and marches into what was soon called the New Deal. While you have that word new, you're in trouble. Teddy Roosevelt had campaigned on the new nationalism, had a book he wrote called that. Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on the new freedom and had a book written. I guess he probably did write it, actually. Those guys actually could write. Now there was going to be the New Deal. And so you had this rapid centralization of power, overwhelming centralization of power, unprecedented in American history. Budget deficits on an unheard of scale, federal spending on every conceivable kind of what we would call boondoggle, just to get men back to work. People were afraid. They were out of work. 25% of the population had no jobs. It was a disaster. 25% of the working force had no jobs. They weren't working. So you had fear because of the recession, and it turned into the Depression. You had a crisis in American politics. And so those people who had been perceived as progressives came into their own. And then in some cases, you began to see the infiltration of communists into the government. Communist cells began to operate in Washington. The one that became most famous in retrospect was in the Department of Agriculture. And these weren't progressives, these were communists. These were Marxists. They wanted to transform American society on a completely new basis. Now, there weren't many of them by comparison, but they were there and they had jobs. And in infiltrating and moving the country as best they could in the direction of actual Marxism-Leninism, you began to see something completely foreign to the history of American political life. Now, they weren't open about this. They were very, very quiet about it. They were cells. They were communist cell organizations. But they came into the government under the New Deal with the new relationship that Roosevelt had in recognizing the Soviet Union. And there was, in that sense, a New Deal. And it was moving the country further to the left. Now, there was opposition to Roosevelt, but it wasn't very well organized. And most of the people you would call the old Clevellandites, the real limited government people, the gold standard people, the people who didn't want the central bank, who did not want the income tax, there were so few of them that they weren't even a political force. They were a few writers. A few writers contributed to this. Probably the more famous of them, a man named Garrett Garrett, wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. And you had Rose Wilder Lane, who was the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder of the Little House on the Prairie fame. She was one of them. They were unknown people, tiny audience, a few books, a few magazines. Saturday Evening Post was pretty conservative. And you had a few of the old-style civil libertarians like H.L. Mencken, who did oppose Roosevelt, who did oppose the New Deal based on their hostility to the expansion of federal power. So Mencken was one who at least voiced some opposition. But on the whole, there was no movement. There was no conservative opposition. Republicans said, "You're going too fast." Republicans were tied more to Hoover than they were tied to Calvin Coolidge. And the Republican Party becomes an opposition party. They don't like Roosevelt. He's referred to as that man. And they are opposed to that man. But there's no system. There's no systematic development of an alternative. There's no political philosophy associated with it. It's just opposition to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And there is very little opposition. It's not effective. And so by the time you go into the war, it's over. There is no more opposition to Roosevelt during wartime. It is essentially the complete overwhelming and destruction of anything resembling a conservative movement. We'll talk about the revival in the next presentation.